Hey there, welcome to Factually. I'm Adam Conover. Thank you so much for joining me on the show again. You know, homelessness is one of the most pressing problems in America today. But even though a lot of us see it on the street every single day, the truth about it isn't always what we expect. You know, I've told this story before on the show, but it bears repeating. A couple of years ago, I was volunteering at my local homelessness coalition, a wonderful organization called SELA. And we had a drop-in center where folks could come and pick up clothes. And one day this fella comes in, he's looking at the shirts. He picks out a crisp white shirt and he loudly says, "Oh, hell yeah, I can wear this shirt to work." And I went up and talked to him. I asked him what was going on. It turned out he had a full-time office job and he still could not afford a place to sleep that night. In fact, 40 to 60% of homeless people have jobs. But since wages have not kept pace with rent for decades, it is really easy to be gainfully employed, even full-time, and still be homeless in this country. The truth about homelessness does not match what a lot of us think or what a lot of us see on the street. For instance, our vision of homelessness is dominated by people who live on the streets, but that is not the only form of homelessness in this country. Many homeless people live on and off in motels, or they sleep in a car parked in their friend's driveway, or they permanently couch surf. Their plight is totally hidden from us. It's invisible, even though our society is constructed to make it more difficult for them to live than most of us can ever imagine. Now, on the show today, we have a journalist and an anthropologist who has just written an incredibly well-reported and infuriating book on the truth about homelessness in this country and what it is like to be unhoused and employed in America. Before we get to that interview, I want to remind you that if you want to support this show and all the conversations we bring you every single week, head to patreon.com/Adam Conover. $5 a month gets you every episode of this show ad-free. And if you want to come see me on the road in Oklahoma, Washington State, Brea, California, we're adding new dates all the time. Head to adamconover.net for all those tickets and tour dates. And now, please welcome Brian Goldstone, the author of the new book, There Is No Place for Us, Working and Homeless in America. Brian, thank you so much for being on the show, man.
Thank you, Adam. It's great to be with you.
So what do people most often misunderstand about homelessness?
I think that a huge misconception is that people who are experiencing homelessness need to just go get a job, that work, is an exit from this really severe form of deprivation. There's a whole range of other myths and stereotypes and misconceptions mixed in with that, homelessness is caused by addiction or mental illness or laziness. And I think that the idea that work could actually accompany homelessness and not be an exit from it is really shocking to a lot of people, which is why, this book focused on kind of the rise of the working homeless, I think is so scandalous to many.
How did you come across this idea?
I actually first got the idea for a magazine story on the subject when my wife, who is a nurse practitioner here in Atlanta, she was working at a place called Mercy Care, a community health center. And this is around 2018. She began to notice one patient after another. She would be talking to them and they would tell her, that they were working at McDonald's or Walmart or packing boxes for Amazon or driving, for Uber and Lyft. And when they finished their shifts, they weren't going to an apartment. They were, going to a shelter or crashing, in overcrowded apartments with others, or even sleeping on the street or going to these squalid extended stay hotels. Or even, sleeping in the very cars they had just done those Uber and Lyft, runs into the airport or wherever. And she was stunned by that when she told me, about this trend she was noticing. I had been reporting on various things for magazines, different parts of the world. And I had read a good deal about homelessness just as a, somewhat educated person, somewhat progressive person. I thought I was kind of educated on the issue. And I had never seen this, work and homelessness sort of thematized. I had never seen it discussed in any explicit way. And I was really surprised when I plugged the phrase working homeless into an academic search engine, expecting this plethora of articles to appear. There was pretty much nothing on this phenomenon. And so that was the initial kernel that kind of sparked the idea. And then I ended up writing a story for the New Republic magazine following one family here in Atlanta, and that grew into the book eventually.
Yeah, it's funny how narrow our conception of homelessness is, right? Because the most visible form here in Los Angeles, it's tent encampments.
Totally.
And it's people, who are in some amount of distress, sort of wandering the streets, right? There's the very visible version of it. But so much of the true story of homelessness is like really invisible from us. Right? A lot of the people that you mentioned who are driving Uber and then sleeping in their cars, well, that's not actually something that I would see walking down the street, right? And so it's not captured in our concept. Is it not captured in the data either?
So, to your point, I was absolutely astonished to discover that what we see on the street is really just the tip of the iceberg. The tents are just the tip of the iceberg, that there's this entire universe of homelessness out of sight that we're not seeing. And yes, that is reflected in the data itself, because every year when what is called the point in time count, the federal homeless census, every year that's conducted, only those who are visible on the streets or living in homeless shelters are counted. Everyone else, literally does not count. All the families I write about in this book, the 5 families who I followed over several years, and the the tens of thousands of families like them here in Atlanta, none of them are counted in that annual census. So, it's not just that there's this whole world of homelessness that we're not seeing. They're also, they've been written out of the story that we as a country have told ourselves about homelessness. And that has had fateful consequences, not just for our sense of the true severity and scale of this disaster. By cobbling together different data sources in the book, I argue that a true estimate of the number of people who are homeless right now in America is roughly 6 times that of the official count.
Wow.
And that is crazy, because the last 2 years, the point in time count has been the highest level on record. Like 2 years ago, it was the highest level on record. And then this last year, it broke that record. So we're looking at like truly historic figures in terms of skyrocketing homelessness. And the true number is around 6 times that amount. I point out in the book that if we gather just here in Georgia, all of the families and individuals who are excluded from the federal census of just those homeless in Georgia, you could fill the stadium where the Braves play 3 times over, just with those who are left out. So we're talking about a mammoth population of people who are not just invisible, but maybe we could get back to that, but like rendered invisible. This is an active production of invisibility that serves very particular purposes.
Well, I mean, this sounds like, honestly, one of the headlines of your book is this figure. And look, I've done those point in time censuses myself. There's a homeless count here in Los Angeles. It relies on volunteer labor. Folks from across, homelessness services will show up on one day and canvass the city. And I did it as part of a volunteer organization I've worked with called SELA, which is a neighborhood homelessness coalition here in my neighborhood. And, you go out with a clipboard, you cover your little tract, couple acres, whatever it is, a square mile. And then you count the number of people that you see on the street. And, you're counting individuals, you're counting tents, and then you're also counting vehicles. But then the question is, how do you know whether someone's living in a vehicle or not, right? If you can tell when you see an RV that has somebody living out of it 24/7, it's pretty clear most of the time. But if someone's sleeping in the back seat of a car, or they're sleeping in, a van parked in someone's driveway, right? You're not going to see that's going to look like a normal vehicle. And then that doesn't even count the number of people who are sleeping on couches. And that doesn't count the number of people who, well, guess what? They're doing that half the time. The other half of the time, they're paying for the worst motel you've ever seen.
Totally.
Right?
Totally.
I think a lot of people might have had the opportunity of accidentally staying in a motel that is actually used by mostly housing insecure people.
Yeah.
I've had that happen to me before. I'm like, oh, wait, this is not a hotel for tourists.
Yeah.
This is a hotel for people who are checking in for a night or two to get off the street, right?
Totally.
That's their clientele. I'm getting that vibe. I'm staying there, but I'm seeing that, right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
So is that population really not being I mean, of course it's not being captured by the government. It's not being captured by the census that I took. But are there researchers out there who are like doing the math on how many of these folks exist? Or do you really feel like you're trotting, new ground here?
I mean, so there is new research that has shown, using census data, using community survey data, showing the number of families who are like doubled up with others in overcrowded apartments, and where they are in those circumstances because of economic reasons, like not because their house is being renovated and they have to stay with friends for a couple of weeks, but because they have lost their housing, they can't afford housing of their own. They are in effect homeless, but they're staying with others. Research has begun to count that population. And really the only data we have nationally on people living in these motels, extended stay hotels and motels, actually comes from the Department of Education. While HUD is the federal agency that is in charge of counting homelessness nationwide. HUD is the agency that is responsible for allocating resources for homeless assistance. But the Department of Education, they do count through schools the number of school-age children living doubled up with others and living in these hotels and motels, as well as, cars, RVs, and so forth. And, we know that the data the Department of Education has, as important as it is, it's widely acknowledged that this is a vast undercount just because of the challenges of counting these children. It's almost entirely dependent on families kind of self-reporting their situations. Often, when a parent needs help getting their kid to school because there's no, school bus that comes to this motel, they have to talk to the school social worker, and then that family is counted. But the Department of Education does use a definition of homelessness that is crucially more expansive than HUD's definition. And the reason it's more expansive is because teachers and school social workers and principals, they saw over the last couple of decades, they saw the effect that living in these situations had on students, that these kids were just as much homeless, just as vulnerable to trauma, just as vulnerable to, what public health researchers call toxic stress as kids living on the street or in tents or, in shelters. And so the Department of Education was like, we need to count these kids. We need to get them resources, at least get them the few resources available to us, like bus cards or grocery cards, gas cards, and so forth. And it's, just as a side note, that's why it's just utterly devastating that the Department of Education is now being dismantled.
I was about to say.
Yeah, I mean, we're about to lose just the minimal data that we have on this vast population of children. But to get back to your original question, no, I mean, this really is kind of uncharted territory as far as our conception of the scale of homelessness in America is concerned. We do have more local research, like here in Atlanta, the Southern Poverty Law Center a couple of years ago did a pretty rigorous estimate of the number of families living just at the bottom sort of spectrum of these motels, like the worst kinds of hotels, not the Residence Inn or Homewood Studios, but places like you described where just squalid living conditions, really slum conditions, mold, rodents, you name it. They're extremely expensive at the same time. It's not that they're cheaper. But the Southern Poverty Law Center estimated, between 30 and 45,000 families and individuals living in these places just in Metro Atlanta alone.
Wow.
So it's a huge phenomenon. It's a huge population, and we're missing it. And if I could just say one more thing about these hotels, since we're on the subject, what blew my mind was not just the fact that these hotels that I, as a resident of Atlanta, drive by every day, not realizing that these are basically for-profit homeless shelters. These are places where families and individuals are pushed into once they have been kind of forced out of the formal housing market because of low credit scores, because of an eviction on their record. They become trapped in what one family in the book calls this expensive prison of these motels and hotels. And it wasn't just shocking to discover these are basically for-profit homeless shelters, because when you don't have like a family homeless shelter, as we don't here in DeKalb County, one of the most populous counties in the South, there isn't a single family shelter. So when a family becomes homeless, they either are in their car, they're on the street, or they're in one of these shitty hotels.
Wow.
And so that it's not just that part that was shocking. What was truly shocking to me is that, here in Georgia and really across the country, private equity firms and Wall Street investors have been buying up vast swaths of America's rental housing, of the single family rental homes of homes here in Georgia and beyond. And it's not just that they are making the housing people already have more insecure through, these automated eviction systems and jacking up rents and evicting people to get in wealthier tenants and so forth. But like Blackstone and Starwood Capital, these two private equity giants, they actually saw during the pandemic how profitable these extended stay hotels are. And they spent $6 billion buying Extended Stay America during the pandemic because they saw like that amid a housing crisis, this is like hot territory. This is if you can corner the market, not just on the housing people already have, but on the places they're forced to go once they become homeless, you can make a lot of money off that. So that totally blew my mind.
That is mind blowing. I do want to say you don't need private equity is not necessary to make America's rental housing horrible, right? I just want, a lot of people love to blame those private equity companies, but also quote unquote mom and pop landlords, which is what you heard a lot about during the pandemic, especially here in Los Angeles. Oh, we have to protect our mom and pop landlords.
Yeah.
Are also folks who evict people and gouge rent and are profiting unnecessarily. Oftentimes a mom and pop landlord is just, a local asshole who owns 5 buildings, so while, those private equity companies deserve a lot of criticism, we have an overall problem in America's rental market. And I think the point that you're making is fascinating because one might ask, hold on a second, if these extremely shitty hotels, these basically for-profit shelters are very expensive, I'm going to assume on a monthly basis, they're more expensive than an actual shitty rental unit would be. Well, why aren't these folks able to afford a shitty rental unit? It's because you have to prove a lot under our system in order to rent a place. Having money is not enough. You also need to prove credit worthiness. You need to prove, you got to show people bank statements, etc. I mean, anyone who's tried to rent an apartment in a major city will be familiar with this.
Yeah.
So once you are not able to access that system, where do you go? You have to go to this system that is actually designed to extract even more money from you. And then that becomes a funnel to the street because, well, it takes all your money and now you don't have any. And now you're sleeping rough.
If I could just, tell you really quickly the story of one family in the book, Maurice and Natalia, because I think their situation totally illustrates what you're describing.
Please.
And as I was following their journey, it occurred to me, we are familiar with the James Baldwin line about how extremely expensive it is to be poor in this country. I think that their experience and the experience of so many people I'm writing about in this book show how extremely profitable all this precarity has become. So like Maurice and Natalia, they're a 2-parent household, so they already defy a lot of the stereotypes we have about this crisis, that it's just single moms and so forth. And Maurice and Natalia, they are a Black, family, a couple from DC. They grew up in DC. They wanted to raise their kids in DC, but they got priced out of their neighborhood. They got priced out of their rapidly gentrifying neighborhood, and they became part of this phenomenon of the new Great Migration. Their great grandparents had moved to DC from the Jim Crow South, seeking economic opportunity, and now they're being forced to move. So they go to the Black Mecca. They go to Atlanta, where they think they can finally achieve their aspirations, and they actually do for a while. They find an apartment here in one of the suburbs, Sandy Springs, and for about 4 or 5 years they are stably housed. They and their 3 children are they're able to buy a car eventually. Natalia works at the call center for State Farm. Maurice works for Enterprise Rental Car. They have relatively good jobs. And what happens is they are informed by their very nice landlord, their very well-intentioned landlord, that she is going to be prematurely terminating their lease because it's the perfect time to sell this this property, this home. They thought it was their home. It was actually just an investment vehicle for their landlord. And, so they're like, okay, that's fine. But what they realize is now the ground has shifted under their feet. Just in the years they've been renting this place, rents have gone up like 65% in Atlanta. The city has lost 200,000 affordable housing units just in the time they've been renting this place. So the ground has shifted under their feet, and they, when they go to apply for a place, they realize that their credit score, this 3-digit number, that has come to determine whether millions of people in America have access to something as fundamental as a place to live, their credit score has actually gone down over the years because Natalia has student loan debt. And so they are forced to go to this company called Liberty Rent, which is a co-signing company. And, all these business models have sprung up to capitalize on this housing crisis. And this is one of them. So they go with this co-signing company. They end up in this apartment complex where they're paying way, way more than they were previously. And they're hanging on by a thread. Long story short, they have moved into a property, unbeknownst to them, that is owned by a company called Covenant Capital, based in Nashville. And when they, because of some, I won't get into all the details, but because of some personal circumstances, they end up being late on their rent one month, and there's no number to call. When they call the number for the leasing office, they get a recorded message. And instead, what happens is an eviction is filed against them. This automated eviction system, where if you're just a day late on your rent, there's no human to talk to. It just automatically files an eviction. And then finally, they are, they lose their home. That's kind of the first domino that falls. And by the time I've met them, they've been homeless for several months. They move into a studio-sized unit at Extended Stay America. And within 8 months of staying in this awful hotel room where I spent countless hours, I mean, just an awful, awful place with no amenities, no nothing. They have spent $17,000 in the course of 8 months. That's more than double what they were paying for a 2-bedroom unit down the street. But again, like you said, because of this credit score, because of now the eviction on their record, they have fallen into what is called the hotel trap. And it's virtually impossible to get out of it. And, part of why it's so hard to get out is because, going back to that discussion about counting and definitions, when they go to try to get assistance, they're told, sorry, you don't fit the definition for what's called literal homelessness. So there's nothing for you. And it's in that sense, the only thing worse than being homeless in America is not even, getting the designation homeless in this country, not even having your circumstances fit that definition. And you're just stuck in this permanent state of limbo. It's really, really bad.
Are they working at this time?
They are. I mean, because everyone in these places, every one of these rooms that you walk by in these hotels are filled with people who are part of the labor force, because obviously, by definition, you have to be working, because you're not paying your rent at this hotel, which again is double what you were paying at an apartment. You're not paying this every month. You're paying it every week. And if you're 1 day late, you will be locked out of your room. There's no court process to go through. You can't get a lawyer to keep you from, getting pushed out of this room. You're just locked out. So everyone is working at these places, or at least has some sort of, disability income. But everyone has income, and that income is just being swallowed up by these establishments.
So during the day, they're going to do what kind of work do people, just give me an example occupation that someone might have in one of these places.
I mean, Maurice and Natalia are the exception. They're working, like I said, at State Farm in the call center. They're working, Maurice is at Enterprise Rental Car. Most people who are part of this population of the working homeless, they are working in low-wage jobs that aren't just paying not nearly enough to afford rent, or certainly, these hotel rooms, or where these hotel rooms are swallowing up 90%, 100% of your income. It's not just a matter of low wages in these jobs, food service jobs, caregiving jobs like home health aides, medical assistants. One of the characters in the book mops the floor at the Atlanta airport, but she's an employee not of the Atlanta airport. The sort of pride and joy of Atlanta's economy, the busiest airport in the world. She's actually an employee of a contractor, and that contractor gives her only 29 hours a week of work because at 30, she would be eligible for benefits. So these are the kinds of jobs that people are working. And I think it's really important to note that in our discussion of the housing crisis, there's this formula of like low wages not being enough to afford skyrocketing rents. And there's a lot of truth to that, but it's not just the wages. It's that the nature of work itself has changed over the last few decades. Like work itself in a growing number of industries has become just exponentially more volatile, insecure. You don't know how many hours you're getting from one week to the next. You don't know, one of the characters in the book, Celeste, she is diagnosed with ovarian and breast cancer. She's living in a place called Efficiency Lodge, one of these extended stay hotels. And she has to decide whether she's going to keep showing up for her warehouse job or whether she's going to go to her chemo treatment. Because if she goes to get chemo, she doesn't get paid at her warehouse job. She has no sick leave. And if she doesn't get paid, she can't pay her hotel bill. And then she and her kids are on the street. So it's not just wages. It's work itself. Work itself has become more precarious.
Folks, if you listen to Factually, it's probably because you actually care about what's going on in the world. But, keeping up with politics can still be overwhelming, right? It moves so fast and changes so drastically, it can feel nearly impossible to keep up. And that is exactly why the NPR Politics Podcast is my go-to for decoding what's happening in Washington and what every decision might mean for you and me. Every episode makes it easy for you to understand what the hell is going on. From the complete restructure of the federal government to immigration policy, tariffs, and trade, they break everything down into normal human language so that you can walk away understanding what the headlines mean for you. Every day, the NPR Politics Podcast team will focus on one thing and boil it down to just 15 minutes or less. Think of it as your political multivitamin. Now, you'll notice that they cover many of the same topics on this show, and that's because the NPR Politics Podcast is one of the resources I use to make sure I'm current on what's going on in the political conversation. Asma Khalid and the NPR correspondents are clear, thoughtful voices in the storm of information, always insightful, always approachable. Politics might move fast, but you can count on the NPR Politics Podcast to declutter it all for you. Listen now to the NPR Politics Podcast, only from NPR, wherever you get your podcasts. The thing that really leaps out at me is the people you're describing are people who work in customer service jobs or visible jobs, right? If I go to State Farm, I go to the Enterprise, rental place.
Mm-hmm.
I am walking down I go through the Atlanta airport, right? I'm walking through the person mopping the floor, right?
Yeah.
That's homelessness. Like I am seeing people who are unhoused. They are living, or at the very least, housing insecure is another term that we use. But I mean, the folks that you have described, this is homelessness. They're paying day to day. They could be on the street any day. They do not have a home. They're staying in a place that is designed to be transient housing, and they are not able to level up. And yet they're doing a job that is anyone would consider like a gainful employment, right? They're wearing a fucking red polo shirt, and they're not able to afford a place to live.
I mean, and that's why, even going back to your original question about like the myths and misconceptions about homelessness.
Yeah.
One idea I think we have, even among liberals and people who are like who consider themselves like more sympathetic or compassionate when it comes to homelessness, is we tend to think of people experiencing homelessness as kind of on the fringes of society, and even spatially, like homelessness in our minds tends to be confined to like Skid Row areas. And so like we tend to think of homelessness as springing up in sort of areas of like extreme poverty, and also as, just people who are on the outside. And those are like images that have proliferated since the 1980s when mass homelessness first exploded in the US. But I think what is like really shocking about the people who we're talking about is these are not people on the fringes of society. These are people whose labor, whose work, whose bodies are actually powering the very growth, the very booming economies that perversely are forcing them not just out of the neighborhoods where they grew up, these formerly Black working class neighborhoods here in Atlanta, but they're increasingly forcing them out of housing altogether. So like they are working the essential jobs. They're working the jobs that a city like Atlanta or Nashville or Charlotte or Austin or Phoenix or LA or any number of other kind of revitalized, cities where this much celebrated urban renaissance has taken place. These people are making that renaissance possible. And yet, like, their working and working some more, it's not enough to just like secure this most basic need.
Yeah. And they're doing jobs that we interact with. They're driving Uber. The amount of time. One of the things that I think is shocking about Uber is the degree to which you encounter like precarity in our economy when you're riding in an Uber. Like, a lot of times I can do an Uber and I'm like, this person's having a rough time, but we just sort of put the headphones in, tune out.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
But like, it's almost a job that is designed for folks who live in precarity. Another one that I think about a lot is, there's unhoused folks in my neighborhood. I know some of them by name. One of them is one of the most industrious recycled object collector, right? Mm-hmm. This guy, every single trash day, right, goes and collects the redeemable cans from everybody's blue bins on the street, does it professionally, does it quickly, does it safely. I separate out my my aluminum cans, the ones that I know that are valuable, to just like save him a little time. He doesn't have to go digging in my bin, right?
Yeah.
And then he takes them to the scrap place that's a half a mile away. That's in it's in the parking lot of a supermarket. And when I go by that scrap place, there is a line of folks who are there dropping off scrap, aluminum and other metals, right?
Yeah.
Look at those folks. Every single one of them is not living rough, but they're definitely in the population that you're talking about, right?
Yeah.
This is work that is our economy is offering to people, right?
Yeah,
Someone said, hey, it's worth it to me to pay people money to bring aluminum cans and other recycled goods. Yeah. But who's bringing them? Not folks like me. It's not like part-time work that, hey, anybody is going to pick up or some high school teen is going to do. It's like specifically structured by our economy to be something that is only, it's at the bottom end of the economic food chain, right? It's somebody thought it was valuable to do, but the people who are doing it are, folks who are unhoused. And it's like our economy has created this role of precarity and keeps people in it purposefully. I mean, how else are you supposed to look at it other than that's the case? We have housing that is only available in such a situation as you described. We have work that doesn't provide you any benefits and provides you only enough to barely scrape by. The system has created this tier of our economy.
Totally.
And we refuse to even count it statistically. Is there another way to look at it, or am I right?
No, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, the kind of labor that you're describing it's important to remember that work can take many forms. It's not just like wage labor that is work. I mean, taking care of kids, taking care of your own kids is what like many moms were doing for years who were receiving welfare, but they were told, no, you have to go like join the formal labor force in order to sort of be able to, I don't know, like enjoy the inherent dignity of work. There are stories of women who were taking care of a disabled, parent or their kid, and they weren't considered part of the labor force. And so, welfare reform, what it did is it forced all these people to go out and get a job. And so it's like, it's not a job if you're taking care of your kid or a disabled, elder. It's only a job if it's someone else's kid or someone else's elderly parent. And, we have all these arbitrary ways of defining what work is and what isn't work. And it's also a reason why I push back against, a kind of lazy reading of even this book, which is that like, oh, you're talking about the working homeless. That's like a segment of the unhoused population that I can like feel sorry for. I can have sympathy for them.
Right.
They're the deserving poor, the undeserving poor. And that's a distinction that, has a long, long history in America going back to the colonial period. But like the undeserving poor are those who aren't part of that formal labor force. But no, I mean, just to survive on the street, you have to engage in all sorts of work it's incredibly hard work, whether you're, getting a paycheck every week or not. But it is a spectrum of labor, a spectrum of work. And I think what really is astonishing is just how much of even the formal, labor market is now comprised of people who don't have housing or who are right on the verge of being pushed into homelessness. It's something that should be a scandal in this country, that like somehow, as you put it, a strong economy can emerge not despite this skyrocketing homelessness, but in some ways like alongside of it and maybe even because of it. Like there's something perhaps intrinsic to our idea of a strong economy and the metrics we use, like a growing GDP, low unemployment, how the stock market is doing, that actually like has this kind of extreme precarity baked into it.
Yeah, I mean, let's expand that a little bit. Like our own lifestyles as affluent people sitting here in, buildings that we're able to pay for. Mm-hmm. I mean, I'm in a podcast studio, but this is part of my work, right? It's paid for partially by the show that we're on right now.
It looks very fancy, by the way.
It's fine. Yeah. It's semi fancy. I like, HeadGum, they're nice people. They're nice for them to let me use the studio, but the economy is working for us, right?
Yeah.
But our lives are, to some extent, upheld by the people on the bottom, right? Because they are sweeping the airport that we go through, right? They are collecting the cans that are recycled into new cans that I then purchase and put on the street.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And then they're picked up again and recycled once again. Like we see these folks as being, a sort of refuse of the system or an unfortunate byproduct, when in fact they're as intricately woven into it as the rest of us are. They're doing work. They are the capitalism is profiting off of them. Yeah. I mean, one way to put it is that like capitalism profits off of my labor. It also profits off of me as a customer, et cetera. Capitalism is also profiting off of these people, right? It's sucking money out of their pockets.
Totally.
They are a profit source that then is distributed through the economy, and sometimes it ends up in my pocket. Just as all economic activity does, right? We're all part of the system that has produced this.
That's why I don't think it's enough in our discussions about housing and homelessness, this idea that like we just need to build more units, like we just need to let the market do its thing and cut all the red tape and just let, private development flourish. Because what that doesn't reckon with is precisely, what you're describing are the ways that capitalism itself, or at least American style capitalism, which is, even more kind of, let's just say it's a very particular kind of capitalism, it depends on this insecurity. It produces it actively. Even going back to the extended stay hotels, there is just huge profit to be made from all of this insecurity. Homelessness has become big business, not just for, the co-signing companies, but for some like really powerful Wall Street, firms. And I just think that like to suggest that all of this could be solved by just like allowing the market to operate in a more efficient way misses not just the really acute power asymmetry that exists in this country between, say, landlords of all kinds, as you mentioned, not just private equity firms, but landlords of all kinds and tenants, property owners and those who are deprived of the opportunity to own property in this country, but misses out on just the just how lucrative this has become and how much of our economy now depends on sucking, every ounce of money, every ounce of profit from all of these laboring bodies.
Well, both things can be true, right? I mean, I think about this a lot, and the fact that housing is such a scarce resource, I'll just say in Los Angeles, where I live, it's not a scarce resource everywhere, certainly is here, right? That is part of the problem. Like part of the problem is that the owners of the resource use it to extract money from the poorest, right? Eviction as a source of revenue. I first became aware of this reading Matthew Desmond's wonderful book, Evicted. You're writing about basically the same subject. You're doing a very important work making this visible, right? But the reason that those like bad actors have so much power over the poor is that the resource is so scarce. If there was massive amounts of housing available, they would have less power. We have two problems working together. Yeah. And so that's why I've always felt, we sort of, pose these two arguments against each other. Yeah. We need more housing and we need less rapacious landlords. We need fucking both. We need both things, right? Yeah. We need more public housing. We need more social housing. We also need more market rate housing. We've got like a fucked problem in America that we need to solve through every resource. And some of those, sometimes capitalism is good at some things. I'm not a fan of the effects of the system overall. I think we need to build more capacity and reduce the power of bad actors and shift our economy in a direction that's more equitable to people and do all these things at once. And I object to anybody who says that we should just do one of them.
Totally. I absolutely agree. And I think that like we don't have the luxury right now of having this sort of Manichaean, either or scenario. I think we need a both and approach to addressing this catastrophe. But I do think that like we have to be clear-eyed about the reality of why this problem exists to begin with, and in a state like Georgia or in a city like Atlanta, we don't have all of the red tape to, building a new apartment complex. We have tons of new units going up. They are just not meant for the people who I'm writing about in this book. They are not meant for that person who is cleaning the floor at the Atlanta airport. And will that affordability eventually trickle down once we, and the filtering process, and once we have enough units at scale? Sure, how many years is that going to take? But I think you're right. We don't have to like choose one or the other. I do think though that we need and this might be jumping the gun a bit to, solutions, but I think we need a pretty fundamental like paradigm shift around housing itself. We see it first and foremost as a means of accumulating wealth. Yeah. And like the few who are lucky enough to own property or to be a landlord, we have this idea that they will just invariably profit to some extent, like off the many, 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 many more who just need a place to live. And, I remember thinking during the pandemic, like there were these two brothers in Tennessee who were vilified for, I don't know if you remember, but they like rented a U-Haul and they were going around to Dollar Generals buying up hand sanitizer and masks. And then they were selling it on eBay and Amazon for like $90 a pop. And I remember thinking, they were on the front page of newspapers and there were calls for them to be prosecuted. And I remember thinking, that's what we've done with housing in this country. Like we've allowed this incredibly precious resource to just be hoarded up. And yes, it has to do with scarcity, in some ways an engineered scarcity, but it has to do with, supply not meeting demand. But once we are in that situation of supply not meeting demand, we've allowed this precious resource to just be hoarded up by, a relatively few number of actors, and then just like auctioned off to the highest bidder. And so the idea that if we just like incentivize those, so to speak, those two brothers to be like a little bit more equitable in how much they're selling that hand sanitizer for, like that seems kind of absurd to me. Like we need to address it at its source, which is, begin treating this resource as something that can be hoardable, that can be profitable in this way. And I just think that until we acknowledge that and begin to like be, I'm an anthropologist. One of the most like basic moves that we as anthropologists do in Anthro 101 is to say, like, our job is to make the familiar strange. And nowhere is that more pressing, I think, than when it comes to housing. Like, we need to become anthropologists and drop in on our society and just be like, how the hell did we come to treat housing in this way? Like, something that everyone needs. Like we don't, treat clean water that way. We don't even treat education that way. We say that if you're a kid and like you're entitled to K through 12 education, regardless of whether you can afford it. We don't say, if you're lucky enough to afford a private school, you could get educated. We say, no, it's even compulsory that you will go to school. And yet we've allowed housing to just, become what a case manager in the book, we've allowed the housing Hunger Games to sort of become the norm, where it's like every person for themselves. And if you need assistance, like you enter a fucking lottery to determine whether you will have access to a housing voucher, where only 1 in 4 people in this country who qualify can receive it. It's just like, that is where the homelessness and housing crisis flows out of. Like, and I feel like we just have to sit with that.
Yeah. Folks, this episode is brought to you by Alma. Isn't it wild how the things we turn to for comfort often end up making us feel worse? I mean, I've definitely caught myself doom scrolling or getting stuck in endless social media loops that leave me feeling more disconnected from the world around me. And in a time when we're stretched so thin between our physical and digital lives, building real, meaningful human connections has never been more important. That's why, if you're seeking some help in dark times, I recommend looking at Alma. They make it easy to connect with an experienced therapist, a real person who can listen, understand, and support you through whatever challenges you're facing. I can tell you firsthand how much finding my therapist who understands me really helped me on my journey of mental health, and you can find your person too. With Alma, you can browse their online directory and filter by what matters most to you. Then you can book free 15-minute consultations with therapists you're interested in. Unlike other online therapy platforms that just match you with whoever's available, Alma lets you choose someone you truly connect with because the right fit makes all the difference. With their help, you can start seeing real improvements in your mental health. Better with people, better with Alma. So visit helloalma.com/factually to get started and schedule a free consultation today. That's helloalma.com/factually. It's interesting in this country because there are public goods that we make sure that everyone has access to, right? Clean water is one of them. Clean water is, in most communities in America, safe and extremely cheap and widely available, right?
Yeah.
Food is actually, it's not free, but or extremely cheap, but like food as a percentage of average person's income has gone way down. There's huge amounts of subsidies to make sure we produce a lot of it because it's a human need, right?
Totally.
We actually do subsidize quite a lot of housing, but what we subsidize is home ownership, right? The government has created the 30-year mortgage as a way to make sure that people were able to buy homes. And you know what? Extremely successful way to build a middle class, right? A lot of people have that. That's what we did. We turned it into an asset where people, they don't just have a place to live, but they have a way to build wealth. And that's benefited a lot of people. I know a lot of folks who are my age, their parents are getting older. And I was just having a conversation with a friend the other day. They were like, my parents don't have any retirement savings, but they do own their house. Yeah. So then eventually they'll sell their house and they'll move into a nursing home, right? Yeah. And great, fine, it's taken care of. You know what I mean? It has served that purpose. What we have not subsidized at all is rental housing. We do not provide any kind of like guarantee or even assistance with people for rental housing on a wide scale. And we are really shooting ourselves in the foot as a society because, for instance, you could look at education and say, okay, we provide free education K through 12 to everybody in America because education is important. We think it's a public good. Sure, maybe that's why we do it. You could also make the more cynical argument that we do it because the labor force needs a place to keep their kids while they're at work, right? Yeah. Everyone needs to go work in the factories. The kids need some supervision, so we go send them to a school. Certainly, a lot of school districts in America, that's mostly what they're doing. It's just a cheap public subsidized daycare.
Sure.
Okay, sure. Why isn't the same thing true of housing? Hey, don't all the people in the factory need a place to live, right? That isn't causing them to, eventually have to move into a tent on the street? Like, shouldn't we be able to make the same argument for, hey, there should just be a lot of, we used to have housing like this. We used to have like SROs and a certain low level of housing that was a little bit more available in this country. And it seems to have disappeared. Like we are harming America by not having this basic resource for people.
Yeah. And I think we have to ask, like, why is it that having so many housing insecure people in this country, specifically workers in this country, hasn't been seen as more threatening to the businesses that employ them, right?
Yes.
Like because you're referencing like the possibility of something like a company town, right? Like where I was just rewatching the other night the movie Harlan County, USA. I don't know if you ever saw that great documentary about a coal miner strike in Kentucky. And yeah, all these people live in the town and it's basically owned by the coal mine, and they use script to, shop at the company store and all that. But they all have housing until they, organize and go on strike, and then they're forced out of their housing. But yeah, like, why isn't that more threatening to have all these workers who are on the verge of homelessness and who might have to even like quit their jobs or leave their jobs in order to attend to like just the needs of being homeless? And I think part of the answer is that the labor force is like at least in these industries, there's a sense, just like with these extended stay hotels, it's sort of like the work analog of this, for-profit shelter system, where if you complain about the conditions, if you say like, I'm not going to deal with this black mold anymore, I'm not going to deal with this faulty plumbing in this hotel room, I'm not going to deal on the work side of it, with these volatile, hours, with the lack of benefits, the response you get is, well, you're welcome to go somewhere else, right? And the reason they hear that response is because there's a sense on the part of either the management of the hotels or on the other side of bosses and management that like someone else is going to fill that role pretty quickly. And so people are seen as expendable, they're seen as disposable. And I think that's why, unlike, certain, more like a coal miner or other, maybe a skilled so-called skilled position or more specialized work, where maybe like there is more of a need to like take care of your workers and make sure they have these, at least, a modicum of stability. I just think that like there's this increasing sense that people are expendable and replaceable. So yeah, I don't know. I think that, or they're all just going to wake up one day and realize that they've created a system that is completely untenable and that it's, in the process of upending itself.
Well, the businesses might not figure that out, right? Like, for instance, we've moved to a gig economy where workers are asked to, bring their own resources. Hey, you don't drive a cab anymore. Now you show up, you bring your own car, your own insurance, right?
That's right.
You provide it all yourself. And we decide how much you're paid almost randomly based on the surge. You clock in, you clock out, right? We have no responsibility for you. We have no connection to you. You're just a person using an app, right?
That's right.
That'll work fine for Uber. I'm not sure Uber is ever going to wake up and go, oh, we've created a horrible economic system, right? Their product is bad. It's horrible being in Ubers, again, partially because you are confronted with, holy shit, this person's having a rough time, and here I am in the back of their car. Like, I think that's bad. I think it would be better if we had a, system that was less, had the precarity or right in our faces like that. I think we all feel better when we go to a business where the employees seem happy and well fed and like that they got good rest, rather than when they're, harried and, in fear and have not slept. But I'm not sure that the businesses that are making the narrow choices to, create a precaritized workforce are the ones who are going to figure that out. I think it's got to be us as a society to look around and go, what the hell happened to our economy, and we've done that at times in the past. I mean, I'm pretty sure that, look at the fucking Grapes of Wrath, right?
Yeah.
It's like, that's America looking around going, oh my God, what the hell happened? We've got destitute people roaming the country in search of work. This is bad. And then, we, in the succeeding decades, we built an economy that worked a little bit better for people in the middle part of the last century. And now we seem to be sliding back to a system where we're okay with the working poor sleeping on the street and doing the labor that all of us rely on. I mean, hopefully eventually we'll wake up and make a change.
Yeah. I mean, I think we've tended to think of homelessness, especially as like we've been given two options in America. Like on one side, it's like judgment or pathologizing people, experiencing homelessness, or on the other hand, like charity, compassion. And I think like, getting back to something you mentioned earlier about just how often we are in close proximity to the working homeless. Every time we're in an airport, every time we're in an Uber or Lyft, we could be in the presence of someone who's in exactly this kind of situation.
It's like when you go buy a sandwich at Subway, you think that the person you're buying the sandwich from has a place to live? You know what I mean? You think that person is living. The sandwich costs $5.
Yeah.
Like you think that this is happening to you every day. You're handing money to someone who doesn't have a place to live, and you don't realize it.
Yeah, and in a city like Atlanta, again, like all the stuff that we, and I use we, broadly here, that we enjoy about the city, all the new amenities, the green space, the new breweries and whatever, the cafes, like all of that is being sort of won at the expense of these people, and it's like, so there's this Toni Morrison line that I think about a lot. She gave it during a commencement speech at Sarah Lawrence College in the 80s, but she's like, imagine, envision if our fun, our enjoyment didn't come as a result of the deprivation of another. And it's like, that is very much kind of the dynamic I think we're looking at in with a book like this or a phenomenon like this, where it's like, it's no longer a question of do we feel compassion for, this Uber driver, this Subway guy, making my sandwich. It's a question not of charity. It's a question of justice and injustice, because something is profoundly broken. There's some benefit being gained. This is something Matthew Desmond also argues in his more recent book, Poverty by America, where it's like, why does this kind of poverty persist? Because we benefit from it, right? Because we profit from it, both as individuals and as a society. And I think like that's where the conversation has to go. It's like, it's not a question of like, do I feel sorry for people anymore? It's just, it's wild that so much of even the debate around homelessness in a city like LA has come to be hijacked by this question of like sympathy or compassion, or do we, do they deserve to be rounded up and criminalized or put into camps? It's like, we're so far from the truth, the heart of the matter, which is that like the reason these people don't have homes is because not just because they can't afford them, because they don't have access to homes they can afford, but because there's this larger system that is somehow thriving as a result of that insecurity.
Yeah, like when you talk about private equity buying up apartment buildings, right? I genuinely do feel that sometimes we overstate how important that is causally, that even if people weren't doing that, even if those large companies weren't doing that, we would have plenty of problems just with smaller local landlords, right?
For sure. Yeah.
But what is remarkable about Blackstone and companies like that, or BlackRock, excuse me, buying
both Blackstone and BlackRock. Yeah.
Okay.
I
always get confused because when I was a kid, there was a famous magician named Harry Blackstone. And then so when I say Blackstone, I'm always like, that must be wrong because that was a magician who used to be on PBS when I was a kid.
Basically, if it has black in it, like, black soul, black heart, black existence, it's a private equity firm.
Well, so what is actually remarkable about these companies buying these buildings? That's your 401k, right?
Yeah.
That's if you have money in the stock market, or you have any investment, or if your money's in the bank, right? Then that large company owning those buildings is part of what is earning you an interest rate, right? On your investments. And that connects you to the experience of the person who is being preyed upon by these businesses.
Exactly.
And it's a really direct connection between you and me. I'm talking about myself specifically. That's what I'm reflecting on in this moment.
I mean, I can't even tell you like the number of conferences or events I've gone to, even like in the world of homeless services, where because so much of the kind of advocacy or resources given to homeless services comes from philanthropy. It's like some of the biggest philanthropy groups in this country, like accumulated much of their wealth as a result of either directly or indirectly through what you're describing, and I think, but that's true for individuals too. Like my parents, read my book and they were like, what do I do about this? How can we change this? And, a lot of their finances are wrapped up in stocks with BlackRock and Blackstone and all the, and so many retirement funds, pension funds, like you mentioned, are wrapped up in this. And I think it goes to something, another point, you talked about like home ownership being this means of like even just being able to retire in America. And I think we have to grapple with that when, those of us who talk about like decommodifying housing or removing housing from sort of speculation and wealth accumulation, like we have to grapple with the fact that in this country, people need a home. They need to own a home, those who are lucky enough to be homeowners, because that's in many ways the only way they are going to have a future and retire or put their kids through college. And like in countries like Austria, where like Vienna, for instance, has been able to have just incredible success with what's called social housing, kind of public housing done right, public housing without all the stigma attached to it and without poverty being concentrated in these housing units and for people across the income scale. But, social housing is able to be what it is in a city like Vienna or in a country like Finland because all of the other interlocking systems that have made our housing crisis possible and this homelessness crisis possible aren't there. Like they don't have, they're not dependent on owning a home in order to put their kids through college or in order to imagine retiring. Like there's a larger safety net in place. Like there's guaranteed health insurance and so forth. So it's like, it's hard to just pick out the home ownership piece or just pick out the housing piece and not address all of the other ways that these uniquely American kind of maladies are also conspiring to contribute to this disaster.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think the point here is to say that, like, if you own a home, that's bad and you're complicit. If you have a 401k, you're bad and that's complicit. It's to say, like, this is how devilish this problem is, that, like, we constructed a system over the last 100 years that all of our individual personal prosperity are now tied up in other people's precarity and deprivation, right?
Yeah.
Unfortunately, that is the world that we live in. And that's going to be a really hard thing to extricate ourselves from. The first thing to do is to understand that it's happening.
Yeah.
The second thing to do, I think, would be to propose some policies. So what do you, what are your antidotes, or what's the first few steps that you might have that can help us get our way around this issue, even on a personal level?
I mean, in some ways, and this is going to sound like a cop-out, like I feel like my kind of modest contribution to all of this is simply to document the sheer scale and nature of the problem,
yes.
To widen the lens, to and really to historicize in some ways, to explain how it is that our field of vision has become so narrow, how it, going back to the Reagan administration in the 80s, like how it is that the narrative around homelessness and who is counted and sort of the magnitude and severity of the problem was allowed to become so narrowly defined. And because when you narrowly define it, it's easier to claim that you're tackling the problem. And it's also easier to sort of like mistake symptoms for causes, to say that like people are homeless because they're in the throes of mental illness or because they seem to be, in the grip of like substance use and so forth. Like, no, that's not what caused, for instance, children under the age of 6 to be the fastest growing segment of the homeless population, even in the 80s. So it's like, I do feel like my contribution is to first say, like, let's widen the lens. Let's see just who we're talking about here and how many people we're talking about, that like, it's not just 770,000, which again is the highest number on record of unhoused people in this country. It's actually closer to 4 million. And to say that is not just to catastrophize. It's to say that, like, as again, to quote James Baldwin, like, not everything that's faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it's faced. Like, we have to confront both the true scale and severity and, crucially, the nature of this problem, like the root causes of this problem. And once we do that, I think we'll see that our kind of like technocratic fixes and nibbling around the edges, a few tiny homes over here, a couple of like supportive housing units at, or like 80% AMI over here. Like again, like we need a both and approach. We need every single thing on the table. We don't have the luxury of like saying, nope, don't need those tiny homes. But let's not kid ourselves. Once we look at the true scale of this crisis, let's not kid ourselves that that's anything close to what's needed. And to answer your question, like what is needed, like there are all sorts of like immediate policy steps we could take to ease people's suffering. Like it's astonishing how rarely in the homeless service space there's discussion of like preventing homelessness from happening to begin with, like keeping people in the homes they already occupy through strengthening tenant rights and tenant protections, and through eviction defense, through like right to counsel. Like the fact that you could go through an entire conference on homelessness and not hear about eviction defense or right to counsel says something about our understanding of homelessness in America. So we have to keep people in the homes they have. We have to like ban retaliatory evictions, where if someone reports unsafe conditions to the authorities, like the landlord can evict them, which happens all the time.
Yeah.
So we have to ban those sorts of things. And like that, just doing that alone will stop this relentless churn where in a city like LA or San Francisco, for every one person who gets into housing, another 4 people become unhoused. And that's why you can throw billions of dollars at like, getting people off the street, and homelessness continues to spiral because you're not stopping that relentless churn. So like prevention has to be a key part of this. But of course, so does like just building more affordable housing, building more housing for people like the families I write about in this book, and making it easier for the families who are languishing in these hotels and motels or in their cars or in shelters to get into housing through, like banning like extortionate application fees, and all the ways that people are trapped, through the use of credit scores and the way like medical debt tanking your credit score. That's something that the FTC under the Biden administration had just passed a rule like banning, removing medical debt from credit reports, and DOJ like has now basically erased that progress. So like there are all sorts of like kind of low-hanging fruit policy solutions that can be enacted immediately to ease people's suffering. At the end of the day, like the North Star, I believe, this is I guess just my opinion, the
Please.
North Star has to be just a truly massive public reinvestment in kind of public housing done right.
Yeah.
I just don't think that the private market on its own will ever be incentivized to provide for the housing needs of those who are at the bottom end of the income scale. And that's a huge number of people in this country. So in the absence of being able to incentivize the private market, in the absence of, landlords in cities like Atlanta, landlords are not incentivized anymore to even accept a housing voucher, because in hot rental markets, you can, you have 5 people competing for 1 unit. So why am I going to take the person with the voucher when I can't jack up their rents arbitrarily, and, where I have to abide by certain safety standards? So like, incentivizing the private market, yes, we can continue to expand the voucher system. We can continue to expand LIHTC, which is low income housing tax credits. And, we can do those things, but we really need just a massive public reinvestment in millions of low income housing units. And the only way we're going to do that is through a paradigm shift around what housing is and who it's for. And and basically grappling with what we've allowed our country to become.
Well, and the first step is informing us about it, which is so we all fucking know it's happening and it's not so invisible right in front of us. And so I really thank you for writing this book and for coming on the show to tell us about it. The book is called There Is No Place for Us. You can get a copy, of course, at our special bookshop, factuallypod.com/books. And of course, every purchase there supports the show and your local bookstore. Brian, where else can people find you on the internet?
Look, I mean, I am trying not to be on X because that is X, but I'm on Blue Sky. I'm on Instagram. You can look me up at briangoldstone.net to see the events that are coming up. But yeah, I'm around.
Thank you so much for being here, Brian.
Thank you, Adam. It's great to talk to you.
My God, thank you once again to Brian for coming on the show. If you want to support the show and all the conversations we bring you every single week, head to patreon.com/Adam Conover. $5 a month, every episode of this show ad-free. For $15 a month, I will read your name in the credits. This week, I want to thank Joseph Mode, Rodney Pattenham, Greg0692, Rick Harthius, Marcella Johnson, Matthew Bertelson, aka The Bunkmeister, Kelly Nowak, Anthony and Jenna Barclay, David Sears, VG Tank Guy, Damian Frank, Matthew, Robert Miller, Griffin Myers, and Oh No Not Again. If you'd like me to read your name or funny username on the show, once again, head to patreon.com/Adam Conover. If you'd like to come see me do stand-up comedy on the road, head to adamconover.net. I would love to see you out there. Thank you to Tony Wilson and Sam Rowden, my producers. Everybody here at HeadGum for making the show possible. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll see you next time on Factually.
That was a HeadGum podcast.